What if I told you there was a Seattle detective that solved an impossible case? That's right, the details are fascinating. This case had gone cold after 27 years, but how did this detective crack it open? Well, let me tell you. It all started back in 1993 when two young women were found dead in their apartment. It was a double homicide, but the police didn't know who the killer was or even what the motive was. All they had to go on was a few scant clues and a whole lot of theories. They believed it might have been a random act of violence, a botched robbery or something more sinister. But without any concrete evidence, they couldn't be sure. For over 2 decades, the case remained unsolved. The detectives had long since moved on to other cases, and the families of the victims had lost hope of ever getting justice for their loved ones. But then something happened that brought the case back from the dead. Enter Detective Joseph Scott Morgan. He's a Seattle homicide detective with an impressive track record. He's the kind of guy who doesn't give up easily, and he's got a nose for this kind of thing. When he first read about the Green River murders, he was intrigued. Could this be the case that finally stumped him? Or could he be the one to finally bring it to a close? Only time would tell. As he delved deeper into the case files, he uncovered some interesting information. The victims had been identified as sisters, and they had been living in Seattle's Green River area. The police had labeled it a double homicide, but they never caught the killer. But Morgan wasn't deterred. He was convinced that there was still enough evidence out there to solve the case. He started by retracing the steps of the investigation. He looked at the crime scene photos, examined the evidence, and interviewed the people who had been involved. He wanted to get a feel for what had happened here. What was the timeline of events? What was the relationship between the victim and the suspect? And, most importantly, what was the motive? But despite his best efforts, he came up empty-handed. The evidence was too old and too degraded to provide any useful information. And the witnesses' memories had faded with time. It seemed as though the case was truly a cold one. But Morgan wasn't ready to give up just yet. He decided to take a different approach. Instead of focusing on the physical evidence, he would focus on the people involved in the case. He started by interviewing the family and friends of the sisters. He wanted to get a sense of who they were, what kind of lives they had lived, and whether they knew anyone who might have wanted to hurt them. He learned that the sisters were hardworking students who had big dreams for the future. They were well-liked and respected in their community, and there was no obvious reason why someone would want to hurt them. But as Morgan dug deeper, he uncovered a dark secret that the sisters had been keeping. It turns out they had been involved in some shady activities, including drug dealing and prostitution. They had been trying to make some quick cash to pay for their education, but they had gotten in with some dangerous people. Could this be the motive for the murder? Were the sisters killed because of their involvement in the drug world? As Morgan followed this lead, he uncovered a web of deceit and danger. He learned that the sisters had been dealing with a ruthless drug dealer named Curtis Flowers. He was known for his violent temper and his willingness to do whatever it took to protect his business. Could Flowers have ordered the sisters killed to send a message to other dealers? With this new information, Morgan was able to get a warrant to search Flowers' house. He and his team descended on the house and conducted a thorough search. But they didn't find any evidence that could link Flowers to the crime. It was a frustrating dead end, but Morgan wasn't ready to give up. He decided to take one last stab at it. He went back to the original crime scene and took another look at the evidence. This time, he was able to spot something that had been overlooked. A small piece of fabric that had been caught on a nail in the wall. It was a tiny detail, but it was enough to send him down a new path. With this new clue in hand, Morgan was able to get another warrant, this time to search a local dry cleaner's. The fabric had been identified as a type of material that the dry cleaners used to press clothes. Could this be the link that finally connected the killer to the crime scene? The search turned up some interesting results, but nothing concrete. However, a few days later, the lab called Morgan with a breakthrough. The fabric had been identified as a match to a jacket that had been in Flowers' house during the search. It was a circumstantial link, but it was the best lead they had. Now it was time for Morgan to make his move. He assembled his team, and they prepared to arrest Flowers. But as they closed in on him, they discovered something that made them all gasp. Flowers had taken his own life. It was a tragic end to a manhunt that had spanned decades, but it also meant that the case was still far from over. With Flowers dead, the evidence against him would be inadmissible in court. They needed to find another suspect, someone who could provide the missing link between the crime scene and the victims. After weeks of investigating, they had a name: Gary Ridgway. Ridgway was a truck driver who had been on the radar of the police before. He had a history of violence against women and a criminal record to match. Could he be the monster they had been searching for all these years? With a warrant in hand, the police searched Ridgway's home and found some disturbing things, including a photo of one of the victims. It was a major breakthrough, but they needed more. They needed to find witnesses who could put Ridgway at the crime scene. And then one witness came forward. She had seen Ridgway's truck near the crime scene around the time of the murder. It was the evidence they needed to make an arrest. When they finally arrested Ridgway, he tried to keep his cool, but the jig was up. He was guilty. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and he couldn't run anymore. As the handcuffs were placed on him, he confessed. He told the police where he had hidden the bodies of the sisters and confessed to killing them. He was so remorseful that he even apologized to the families of the victims. It was a tragic end to a decades-long manhunt, but it was also a victory for justice. Ridgway was convicted of 2 counts of aggravated murder and sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences in prison without the possibility of parole. As he sat in his prison cell, he had to face the consequences of his actions. He would never see daylight again. The families of the victims finally had the answers they had been seeking for so long. They knew what had happened to their loved ones and who was responsible for their deaths. It was a small measure of justice, but it was all they had. Detective Joseph Scott Morgan was hailed as a hero. He had solved a case that had stumped the police for decades. His dedication and tenacity had paid off, and the city was grateful. He had brought closure to a family and put a killer behind bars. But for Morgan, it wasn't about the glory. It was about the pursuit of justice. He had simply done his job, and he had done it well. As the years passed, the memory of the Green River murders faded from the public consciousness. But for the families of the victims and those who worked on the case, it would never be forgotten. They remembered the agony of the unsolved case and the elation of its eventual resolution. They honored the memory of the victims and the legacy of the hero who had brought their killer to justice. Now, you need to watch. Cop pulls over driver for speeding, and then something crazy happens. Or, have a look at this. Crazy neighbor keeps moving my fence. I'm not going to take it anymore.